Hi, welcome to Left Foot Media. My name is Brendan Malone. Well, Star Wars The Last Jedi is back on the radar because it's finally been released in its various home theatre editions. Now, I sat down a couple of days ago and watched the movie again, this time with my children. This is the first time they've actually seen the film, and they went into it with a total open mind, total blank slate. They haven't seen my YouTube channel. They haven't heard my critique of the film. I didn't say anything to them at all about the movie that was that negative. I wanted them to actually experience it for themselves because I didn't want to be one of those parents who sort of ruined perhaps what could have been a really enjoyable childhood moment for them. I thought, well, I'll let them make up their own mind about what they think about the film. What was really interesting watching the film with them was that they picked up on some of those key frustrations and problems with the storytelling in this movie that I had. If you go back and watch my original videos about The Last Jedi, you can hear me talking all about those in great detail. They picked up on some of those things as well, and as young children, they didn't really understand what was going on or why certain things were happening, and the reason was because those points and of the movie are actually not very good storytelling. And so for a film that's supposed to be directed at children, to have kids going, for example, there's something not trustworthy about that Admiral Holdo, or why is she doing this? Is she a villain, Dad? When Leia did her big Mary Poppins flight back into the ship, my daughters were like, my eldest daughter, who is 11, says, what's going on, Dad? Why is she doing that? Where did that come from? That she just, and the other daughters as well were like, they needed to have it explained to them because this just didn't make any sense what Leia was doing in this particular moment. So it was interesting. And out the other side of the film, basically, they, apart from one daughter who said she thought it was the best Star Wars movie she's ever seen, the others really didn't like it at all. They named other Star Wars films that they thought were better than this one. So it just didn't go over well. They all loved The Force Awakens. They all really loved The Force Awakens, but this one just didn't have the same impact at all. So it was kind of interesting and a little bit reassuring for me that it wasn't just a sort of kid, cynical adult problem, me being the cynical adult who's not seeing this movie the way it's supposed to be viewed. I sat down with my own kids. They went into it with a blank slate, and even they didn't particularly enjoy the film. So I was a little bit relieved about that, I guess you could say. But for me, watching the film again, because the last time I viewed this film was in a theatre, and so many months had passed since I'd last watched the film, and I thought to myself, it'd be interesting to see, now that a period of many months has elapsed, will I still feel the same way about the film? Will it be less jarring to me? Will it be less frustrating? Will I think more fondly of the film? Give it a viewing now with all this time that's passed. Maybe I won't be as critical. In actual fact, there were things about the film. There were one or two things that weren't as jarring because you were expecting them now. You knew these problems were coming. But there are other things that I picked up on that actually, in the end, I would say that it was actually slightly worse this time around for me because there were other things I noticed now that I hadn't noticed on previous viewings of this film in the cinema, and they really stuck out, these unearned and very jarring moments. So, for example, when Rose's sister Paige dies, she's the bomber pilot who dies at that ill-fated bombing run at the beginning of the movie, that whole scene is constructed and written in such a way as if it's supposed to carry some great emotional weight and importance. But it doesn't carry any of that because we don't know who this character is. We don't know anything meaningful about her. The scene is constructed in such a way as if it was meant to be portrayed in perhaps the third act of a film, where you know about these characters and there is meaning and weight and the emotional impact has really been earned, but there's none of that in this film, and yet it's portrayed as if you're supposed to care about all this and what's happening. And there were lots of little moments that I noticed like that became really jarring, lots of little unearned moments that I hadn't seen previously. Poe's disobedience, when he decides to go on that ill-fated bombing run mission and ignore Leia and override her orders. First of all, it's jarring because that's not how his character has been written previously. So in The Force Awakens, he's got that sort of cocky pilot attitude about him, which you would expect, and he's one of the best pilots, and obviously in this film he's now a senior leader in this Rebel Alliance, this resistance, whatever they're calling themselves these days. And by the way, I'm going to use those two terms interchangeably throughout this video, so please don't panic. And yet here he is disobeying orders, and it's just so jarring because, like I said, he hasn't been written this way, and now all of a sudden he's this rogue unit who can't be trusted and just does his own thing. Secondly, it's jarring because that's not really how you end up becoming one of the top leaders in a military force, by being that unreliable. And thirdly, it was really jarring because Leia, the way she reacted to it, she either couldn't be bothered doing anything about it. She's just like, oh, well, cocky, disobedient pilots are going to be disobedient and just make up their own orders on the fly. So, yeah, what are you going to do about it? And it's just like she just didn't either seem to care, or she didn't seem to have any way of stopping him from doing that. Now, this, as I said, this just doesn't make any sense, because that's obviously not how the military chain of command works. If you've got someone, even a senior person in your army, who's going to disobey orders, they can't just flick a switch and then carry on disobeying your orders and convince everyone else to follow them and start issuing orders of their own. That's not how that works. And so the whole thing was really jarring, and it really stuck out for me this time. Snoke's death, really jarring, because just even more noticeable for me this time was like, how does this guy, one of the most powerful evil Force users we've seen in the entire Star Wars franchise, how does he not know that this is about to happen to him? The lightsaber is turning right beside him. Right, it's right there, and it's turning. Did you not even hear it? And as for the people who might say, well, but Brendan, he had his eyes closed. Look, this is one of the most powerful Force users that we've seen in Star Wars. Closing your eyes is irrelevant. We all know how the Force works, having your eyes opened or closed. In fact, closing your eyes, according to the mythology that's been developed in this franchise thus far, it actually strengthens and enhances your focus on the Force. So how the heck did he not know this was coming? It really, really stuck out in a big way this time for me. Holdo's self-sacrificial death, it doesn't carry any weight. This is one of these unearned moments that I was talking about before that I really noticed this time. I mean, last time I noticed the whole issue of weaponizing hyperspace, but this time I noticed the fact that it's not a very earned death. She literally goes from being a character that we don't know much about her. We know very little about her. And what we see of her on screen in this film, you either end up being not sure about her, or you don't like her as a character. She's either someone you don't like, or someone who you think's a little bit untrustworthy, or you're not quite sure about, right? You're still not quite certain. Who is she? What's going on here? Why is she doing this stuff? And then within minutes of all of that, all of a sudden that's been flipped on its head. It's been turned on a dime. And she is now committing this truly heroic act of self-sacrifice, which should carry huge emotional weight. But the problem is she's the wrong character to be doing it, because she's such a confused character for us, the audience, right up till that point. We don't know what to think about her, or we don't like her. And then all of a sudden we've got to really, really like her, because she's about to do this really important act of self-sacrifice. As others have already said, I think it would have been much better if it had been Akbar. It would have been a fitting end to that character instead of the terrible, meaningless ending he was given, and it would have carried more weight for people, because he wouldn't have been this character who'd been previously involved in this weird sort of situation where you don't know what to make of him. So that moment was really jarring and stuck out. It just wasn't that earned. The self-sacrifice moment with Finn, man, this really stuck out for me this time. Even though I knew what was coming, I knew that Rose was going to do her stupid, absolutely stupid, suicidal run where she crashes into him to stop him from sacrificing himself to save everyone, which is just so stupid on so many levels. I knew it was coming, and despite that fact, I'm still drawn into this moment. The crescendo, the emotional crescendo that's building, the way that we focus in on Finn in that cockpit. The music starts the noise starts to die away. There's a real sharp focus, and you're really captured by that emotional moment. And you think, man, you're still sort of hoping maybe it's going to work out differently, even though absolutely know for certain it ain't. And you're really drawn into this moment. And then, of course, this stupid moment happens where Rose crashes into him and then gives him that absurd lecture about how we don't do that silly. We're all about saving people, not sacrificing ourselves. And you're like, this is so dumb. This is still dumb. But what made it even more jarring for me was I noticed this time something I hadn't noticed before, and that was the impact of the crash. This is the first time I actually noticed how much of a major fireball she created by crashing into Finn. She could have easily, in fact, it's amazing that he managed to walk away even without concussion, but he did. She could have easily destroyed both of them. And that obviously would have rendered her whole point totally redundant and useless. And so she would have sacrificed herself to stop him from sacrificing himself. That was you realize the stupidity of that moment. And then you see the impact of that crash and how dangerous and absurd and just insane that whole moment was. And you think, why, oh why, oh why did they write this thing this way? This is just terrible. It was really jarring for me this time. This time around, I noticed that a little bit more about it. And I also noticed something that others have obviously picked up on, and that is how the heck did Finn get back into that base? Luke Skywalker walks out through that hole that's been blown in the side of the base. He then has his standoff with Kylo Ren, and there's this, maybe a semicircle or a quarter circle of these walkers that are all this big massive field of fire that's raining down upon this imaginary Luke Skywalker, and there's this big massive blast zone. It's huge, and somehow Finn has managed to get himself back into the base through that hole. How the heck did that happen? This time it really stuck out to me. I didn't really notice it as much on the previous viewing, but really it stuck out to me this one. And then lastly, there's the whole issue of Luke's death. I don't know why, but this time around it was more jarring for me, and perhaps it was with my kids in the room, because this is something my kids picked up on. One of my daughters said, "Oh, is he dead?" And then one of the other daughters says, "No, he's not dead. No, you can't die like that. He was just using the Force." And then one of my other daughters was a bit unsure about it, and I said, "Yeah, he's died." I explained to them that he had died, and they're like, "Oh, why?" And they didn't really get it. And so for me, maybe that added to it, but it was just so jarring for me. It was like, what, did he have a forced stroke or a forced cardiac arrest? I don't understand this. He died from force exertion. And what an awful waste of that character, when he could have actually turned up on that planet and actually fought a battle, and that would have had so much more meaning. You know, the student versus the master, the former pupil and the former master actually coming together and having a battle. And you realise it would have made more sense, because remember the first time he stood over him contemplating murdering his own nephew, which is still a really awful moment in Star Wars. He's standing over him there, but clearly he changes his mind, and his intent was not to kill him. So he was going to kill him, and then he decided, "Oh no, don't do that." And it was all just mistaken identity. And so when they confront each other, it's not really a confrontation. And so they actually had the opportunity here to have a proper confrontation between the two of them, but they don't. It's just, so very, very frustrating, this whole film. Another thing that really stuck out to me this time watching this film was the fact that it single-handedly more than doubles the amount of Star Wars major cringe moments. Now, the two major cringe moments that existed in the Star Wars franchise up until the release of this film were the Star Wars Holiday Special and the character of Jar Jar Binks. They were just awful. Total missteps, total and terrible miscalculations on the part of those creating the Star Wars franchise. However, this film releases into the Star Wars franchise world 3 more cringe-worthy moments that are just awful cringe moments, that are sort of meme-level cringe, that are on the same level of those other two. And so basically, single-handedly, it more than doubles that cringe count. So you have the shirtless Kylo Ren moment. You have the Luke Skywalker drinking the blue milk after he's milked the teat of that rubber-looking sea cow thing. And then you have, of course, the Mary Poppins moment with Princess Leia. And these are moments that even most people who like the film are sort of either laughing at or they are criticising, right? So there's sort of general, sort of almost universal agreement that these things were awful. And this film single-handedly introduced those 3 elements, which I think I've said this previously in another video. That should have been sort of a warning sign for people that perhaps this isn't as good a film as you think it is, if you're someone who's trying to claim that this film is actually quite a good film. The other thing about this film is that it's definitely not a kids' movie. So one of the responses I've had from people to a lot of my previous videos is, "Oh no, you're just getting upset about a kids' movie. Don't overanalyze it. It's just a kids' film." But this is definitely not a kids' movie, and it really stuck out to me viewing it again this time with a lot of time between the last and this viewing. It really sticks out. It's very, very noticeable to me now how much this is not a children's movie at all. There's lots of little things that you've got a character calling another character a bastard in this film. You've got Luke, who is just a total nihilist, and he's this pessimistic, depressed old man. And just this is not a kid's film. There are kiddie moments in this film, but this is not a kiddie film. The other thing about this film is this is definitely not a new direction. Watching it this time, it really stuck out to me how many moments and concepts have been lifted and stolen from previous Star Wars films and put into this movie. And there's a lot of them, and I really noticed more of them this time around. So you have the good guys who are flying in a ship that cannot get into hyperspace, and so they have to use other flying techniques to try and outmaneuver this superior, villainous, evil military force in space. You have, just like the Empire Strikes Back again, you have a character who is a rogue who betrays a male and female, two of the male and female lead characters. You have an elevator scene with Kylo Ren, the new Darth Vader, and he's in this elevator with none other than Rey, the new Luke Skywalker. And Rey, just like Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader in that Return of the Jedi elevator scene previously, is trying to convince Kylo Ren that he still has good in him and that he can still fight the evil and he can still turn to the light side of the Force. There's an evil emperor who has his own guards who are all dressed in red in his evil throne room, and he brings the two main characters into his evil throne room, and he wants the new Darth Vader to kill the new Luke Skywalker. It's just, honestly, there are so many moments in this film where you realize this is just lifted and stolen from previous films. So people trying to claim that this was a new and original take on Star Wars, I'm sorry, it's just nonsense. And that really solidified for me watching this film again and seeing how many of those concepts and moments have been lifted directly out of previous films. You just cannot claim that this was a new and original direction at all. What this film did was it actually tried to do awful new things with existing characters, and that's where the problem is. It wasn't a new direction, it was just a mishandling of existing characters that actually created this meme, I guess, that people have repeated everywhere, that no, this was a new and original direction. You know, anytime someone criticized Star Wars, the standard response became, no, you don't understand. This was just a new and original take, and you didn't like the fact that it was deviating. No, the problem wasn't that it was deviating. The problem was that it was deviating in a really dysfunctional and poorly written kind of way. That's where the problem lies. And lastly, the other thing that really stuck out for me on this latest viewing of the film was how depressed and morose and tonally how oppressive this film really is. There's so little hope in this movie. Every character is going through some sort of trial or suffering or moment of brokenness or darkness and doubt and questioning, that the sense of hope that is present in every other Star Wars film is totally missing. And I really noticed it. The tone of this film is problematic. And you really notice it compared to previous Star Wars films. Even something like, say, Rogue One, which had some pretty dark content. You've got one of the Rebel Alliance who is killing an informant in order to stop him from spilling the beans that might give away the rebels, right? It's some pretty dark stuff in this, yet there is still the sense of hope in this film. It's a movie where all of your main characters die at the end, but there's still a sense of hope. This film, that sense of hope is lacking because there is no character who actually acts as an anchor point for hope in this film. And as a result, it's just so, as I said, the tone is morose. It's just everyone is suffering or struggling. And I'm not surprised by that, because when I think about Rian Johnson, Looper is kind of like that as well. It has a sort of, a almost, I don't want to say nihilistic tone, but it has a tone where everyone's cynical and jaded, effectively. And the world is very jaded and dark that they're living in. And that sort of tone is present in this film too. So it's not surprising, because it's Rian Johnson, that he has a sort of consistency in the way he writes his films, that would happen to make its way into this movie. But you really notice it, and for me it really stuck out on this viewing. And what's interesting for me is how bad the character of Luke Skywalker is. That, for me, this point really made the problems with Luke Skywalker worse. The problem with Luke Skywalker is not that he's a jaded character. Like I've said previously, I'm okay with the idea of writing an older Luke Skywalker as someone who's a bit jaded. The problem was, he's not simply a bit jaded in this film. He's not simply a darker version of Luke Skywalker who's a bit older and who's suffered a bit more, and that's reflected in his character. He is now a nihilistic, depressed old man that you just don't want to be around. And it's just awful. It brings the whole film down, because Luke Skywalker really was the character in this movie who needed to be the anchor for hope. And there's ways they could have done it by still making him jaded. You could have had a Luke Skywalker who was jaded. If you'd given good motivation for his battle between him and Kylo and everything that sort of subsequently unfolded, that would have helped a lot. And secondly, if perhaps he had been jaded in a different way, like in this film, he's just nihilistic, he's given up all hope, he effectively doesn't believe there's any good in the world anymore, and he is literally just waiting to die. And at points in this film, on this subsequent viewing, I found myself sort of thinking, well, why doesn't he just take an overdose and end it all now? Or why doesn't someone give this guy a Prozac, please? Because this is just, it bogged the film down. Now, he needed to be the character, though, who actually was the anchor for hope in this movie. Because every other character is going through some sort of conflict, some sort of suffering, some sort of serious doubt or moment of brokenness throughout this film. And Luke was the appropriate character to hold that all together so the film doesn't get bogged down in that. Now, it can't be Leia because she's in a coma for most of this movie, so it obviously can't be her. And it made sense also for it to be Luke because not only is he not in a coma, but also he's the new character in this second film. This is his first entry in a major way into this trilogy. So it made sense for him to be the guy who, despite everything else, the darkness and difficulty and suffering that everyone else was facing, to be the one guy who was actually giving hope. And on top of that, it made sense because that's who his character has always been in Star Wars. He's always been the hopeful, optimistic hero. That's who he's been, even through suffering and difficulty. Like I said, there have been previous Star Wars films that have been dark, but they still had hope about them. Rogue One, darker, still had a sense of hope. Empire Strikes Back, darker, but it still had that sense of hope and moments of levity in it that actually, so you didn't get bogged down in the darkness or the darker tone of the film. But this movie, it's completely lacking, and it really amplifies how badly written Luke was and why that was such a misstep in this film. Because basically, it has a big impact on the whole entire plot and the whole entire tone of this film as a result. There's no linchpin. There's no linchpin character that gives you the sense of hope that they want you to have at the end of the film, because they're all sitting around and it's all of a sudden like, hey, we've still got reason to be hopeful, even though we've been betrayed and abandoned and broken and we're uncertain, there's still hope. It's like, no, there's not, because you've spent most of the film with every character telling us about their brokenness and their difficulty and their suffering and their darkness, etc., etc., etc. And now you want us to believe that there's still hope. Let me finish by saying this. For that group of people who are still stubbornly clinging to the notion that this was one of the great Star Wars films, or it was one of the best Star Wars films, it was just totally misunderstood by people, or it's been misrepresented by some nasty, horrible fanboys, go and look at Rotten Tomatoes. This film has the lowest audience score of any of the Star Wars films, and there's a reason for that, a really good reason. It's because this is the worst of the Star Wars movies thus far. It's the only Star Wars film to go below 50% on the audience rating, and it's only got 47%, and I think that could drop even further by another percentage point or two over the coming 6 months as more and more people catch up with it on home theatre, perhaps for the first time, and then get on Rotten Tomatoes and let their views be heard. But this film, at 47%, has a audience score that is 12% lower than what The Phantom Menace has. And The Phantom Menace was the film that gave us one of the worst moments in Star Wars history, Jar Jar Binks. There's a reason for that. It's not misrepresentation. It's not because the film has been misunderstood. It's because this is not a good Star Wars film. And this viewing really cemented that for me. And it really made me realize that in many ways, this isn't really a Star Wars film. And the lesson for the filmmakers here and for the Disney studio executives, if they're actually willing to actually learn their lesson, is that you cannot just take any old film, stick a bunch of Star Wars characters in it, stick Star Wars on the side of it, and then expect people to love and embrace it and buy into it as a Star Wars movie. It actually turns out there are certain parameters and certain traits that Star Wars films have to have. There's plenty of opportunity for originality. Rogue One, for all of its faults, I think is the best of the new movies that's been released so far, because it's got some new and original content and characters, and it's a film that also feels like a Star Wars film. It has the key elements of Star Wars, but it still branches out in new directions. It doesn't just write to formula. and it's a really enjoyable experience. I mean, this is the first film without Jedis, right? And yet it is still a really enjoyable Star Wars experience. Rogue One. The Last Jedi doesn't even come close, according to the audience, and they're right. Because, as I said, you can't just take any old thing and then stick Star Wars on the side of it and say, well, look, it's got some Star Wars characters and some Star Wars branding on the side of it. This is a Star Wars movie. You've got to have some of those key elements present, and there's still plenty of scope for creativity, but you've got to have those things present. And if you don't, you end up with a film like The Last Jedi. And like I said, there's a reason why the audience have disliked this film in such huge numbers. It's because this is not a particularly well-crafted piece of filmmaking, despite the fact, as I said at the very beginning, this is still, and it was reinforced again for me watching it the other day, a visually stunning film. It's probably visually one of the better Star Wars films. But it doesn't have the goods where it really counts. The storytelling is awful in this film. And what this film shows is that it doesn't matter how much amazing visual eye candy you've got. If you don't have a good story, you don't have substance, and the audiences just aren't going to rate it, regardless of what the critics are saying or the commentators who are happy to be in the pocket of one of the biggest and most lucrative studios currently churning out movies today. As per usual, I'd love to know what your thoughts are. Please let me know in the comment section below. Do you agree or do you disagree? And if you like the content I'm making and you'd like to see more of it, then please support me on Patreon. There is a link in the description below, and there is a link on screen at the end of this video. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time on Left Foot Media.